My name is Raphael Bostic. I'm a professor in the Price School of Public Policy, and I'm the director of the Bedrosian Center on Governance and the Public Enterprise. And it's a real pleasure for me to welcome you to USC, welcome you to campus. Many of you hopefully is welcome back to campus. I'm hopeful that you really enjoy the program that we have today. I think it'll be fun, it'll be interesting, and give you some real insights into how Washington works, how the media works, how our society works in terms of figuring out what we do in a public context. I want to say a little bit about the Bedrosian Center for those of you who may not be familiar with it. And I also want to talk a bit about the Holt Lecture before we get into the main program. The Bedrosian Center is a center that is focused on issues of governance. And the way I describe governance is when we think about the policy space, there's the design of policy, so you got to figure out what it is you want to do. And then there's the implementation of policy, which is actually getting it done. You actually have to do it. And many times, the reality is that we actually know what we want to do. The challenge is actually getting it done. Maybe the politics don't work, maybe the institutions are not functioning, maybe our capacity in our social spheres and our connectedness are not what they need to be to actually be effective. And I'm an economist by training, I should say that as well. So I'm not a governance expert in that I don't study this every moment of my life. But I've done a little bit of governance. I've done a little policy making in Washington. And what I found is that almost 50% of the time, if not more, when policies didn't work, it was because we couldn't get it done, not because we didn't know what to do. And so when I came back to campus, I was really interested in trying to lift up issues of governance so that we all are actually sensitive to the reality that we need to invest in our public institutions and our nonprofit institutions and the private institutions that all come together to deliver the policies that we all rely upon, that we all live in. And we don't do enough of that. And so I'm happy to be here to pass that message on and get as many people to, when you leave here, if there's going to be a lot of things on your mind, but I do want, we need to be thinking about our governance capacity as one of them. And we'll talk a bit about that today. So that's the Bedrosian Center. If you haven't already, you should get on our website, subscribe to our mailing list. You can see a lot of our events. We try to video as much as possible. And I think what you'll find is that we have really interesting conversations, very thought-provoking, and hopefully it will give you food for thought as you do the things that you do on a daily basis. All right, so the Holt Lecture. The Holt Lecture is a lecture that was established through a generous gift by Dennis Holt. And Dennis is in communications. And so he wanted to make sure that the Price School had a presence on issues around communications and policy. How do they intersect and how do they interact? Because as you'll hear today and as you guys see every day, our understanding of policy is shaped by how it's communicated to us. The public's understanding of policy is shaped by how it's communicated. And so we want to focus on those issues. And one of the things we've tried to do is really be expansively broad. So there's a lot of communication that goes on a lot of different aspects of policy. So a previous Holt Lecture speaker was Nate Silver. So if you know who he is, he communicated not about any specific policy, but how our political process was working. And he got a lot of people to think very differently about polling, about statistics, about the horse race, if you will, and it led to a really interesting conversation in that context. Today, we actually have a slightly different take on communication and policy. It's my pleasure as you all know, we're going to hear from Dana Perino. And before we get too far into that, I do want to say our structure, I don't like speeches, right? So I'm not a big speech person. And so what we're going to do, we've asked Dana to prepare some opening remarks, and then Dana and I will have a little back and forth to cover some issues, and then we're going to open it up to have it be a conversation. I really do think that conversational experiences are much better than we all just listen and one person talks at us. So we're going to try that, and I hope that you enjoy that as well. All right, so now, Dana Perino. Dana Perino right now is the co-host of the Fox News show, The Five. It is one of the most popular shows on cable television, and she's a big reason for that. Before that, she was a White House press secretary in the administration of George W. Bush, and we're going to talk a lot about that. That is a hard job, but Dana did it with grace and style, and never let them see. They say you're never supposed to let them see you sweat. There's real talent there. She's an author of a best-selling New York Times book, and she has actually been a driving force in a number of other best-selling books, including books by Peggy Noonan and Charles Krautheimer. And I would say Peggy Noonan is an inspiration of Dana's, and we actually just did a podcast on the book that inspired her to get into this role. So if you want to listen to that, I think that would be a really interesting thing. The book is Peggy Noonan's What I Learned at the Revolution. And so you should do that. So in addition to the five, Dana appears weekly. She's a regular on the O'Reilly Factor, the Kelly File, and is always called to be present whenever something's happening interesting in an election context. So we're really excited to have her here. This is, I think, I can think of few people who are better suited to deliver a Holt lecture and be part of our Holt program than Dana Perino. Please join me in welcoming her.
The Bedrosians, what a pleasure to meet you. And it's always good for me to get out of New York. Well, always good to get out of New York for lots of reasons. But to come and meet people that might see us on the show. And I think that about Judith and realize that we actually kind of know each other, even though we've just met. And I love that. I like to meet people who think, oh, I know her. She's my friend. And I'm honored to be here. You know, I went to USC as well. It just happened to be in southern Colorado. Of course, when you work in Washington, D.C., amongst elites, one of the things that happens is, oh, so where did you go to school? And I would learn to say USC, and they'd go, oh. I'm like, southern Colorado, oh. But it worked very well for me. It was a smaller school, and I had a speech team scholarship, which enabled me to go to school. But to be able to come here and be a part of this Holt lecture, that is an honor. And I will make sure that I rub it in amongst my colleagues when I see them again on Monday. When Raphael first stood at this podium, I was a little nervous because, you know, Raphael, how tall are you, 6'5"? 6'3". Okay, well, when you're 5 feet tall, anybody seems 6'5" to me. And so the press secretary before me was Tony Snow. And he was a wonderful, wonderful man. Unfortunately, he did pass away from colon cancer complications in July of 2008. But I was his deputy, and he was 6'4", 6'5", and he had a podium that had been built for him by the White House Communications Agency. And because he was needing treatment, cancer treatment, there was one period where he had to take about 3 weeks off for some exploratory surgery and to check things out. And I was a junior Birdman. That's what I like to call myself, as a deputy. And young women in the audience, you probably have read Sheryl Sandberg's book, or you know about it. And if you haven't read it, I encourage it. It's called Lean In. Well, it was one of those times when the only thing I wanted to do was lean out. I was very, very happy to be behind the scenes. I never wanted to be in front of the camera at the White House podium, and I could really make the operation work well behind the scenes. But Tony Snow called me into his office one day, not too long after he'd been there, and he said, sorry to ask you this, but Dana, you're going to have to step up and be the White House press secretary for about 3 weeks. And there's very few times in your life where you don't have an opportunity to say no. But literally, there was no one else in the government that could do that job because I was the only deputy at the time. And so because he was going through so much through his cancer treatments, I just was like, well, put your big girl panties on and deal with it. So I was getting ready to do it, and this young guy that worked for me, Carlton Carroll, came into my office the Friday night before I was to be the acting press secretary, and he said, ma'am, do you think we should have them build you a new podium for Monday? I said, oh, no, Carlton, that is not necessary. That's a waste of time and money. Just get me a little apple box, and I'll stand on that, and it'll be fine. So I did that for a week, and I thought I was doing pretty well. Like, I didn't cause any international incident. Like, there was no war. The president wasn't mad at me. Everything was going pretty well. And I get a knock on my door on the Friday night the following week, and it's Carlton again, and he says, ma'am, I'm really sorry, but I think we need to have them build you a new podium. I said, Carlton, that's crazy. We're traveling next week, and Tony says he's doing well. He's going to be back on time. It's not a problem. And he said, well, actually, NBC News cameraman showed me the shot from the back of the room. And when you're standing on the apple box at Tony Snow's podium, the seal above your head does not say the White House. It says the White Hoe. For a week. And the reason I like to tell that story is that it's hilarious, but it's also about, I really believe there is nobility in public service. And working in public communication, public policy communication, really suited me right down to the ground. That was just exactly what I wanted to do. And when you get to work at the White House, or even in any administration, but certainly at the White House, there's a risk that you can get a big head about it. And one of the best ways not to get what my former chief of staff, Andy Card, called White House-itis was to share the experience with others and to also realize the humility that comes with public service, that you are working on behalf of the citizens of the United States of America, and that's a big deal. And he recommended that every time you walked into the Oval Office that you would say a prayer of thanks before the Marine opened the door for you. And I thought that was a really good suggestion, and I started my day on that foot for 7.5 years, and I really loved that experience. Now, of course, when you then make a career transition and you get to be on television, you move to New York, and you get invited to the Jets game and to sit in the owner's box, I mean, you could get a big head, think, wow, you know, I've kind of made it. This is really great. My husband, who's British, but American by choice, became an American citizen. He loves every American event. He'll go to anything. So when I told him we got invited to the Jets game, and I'm not that into sports, but I knew the Jets weren't that good. Until this season, I guess they're doing better. But 3 seasons ago, they were not good. But I said, Peter, do you want to go to this thing? And I kind of didn't want to go. He's like, yeah, I want to go. So we take the train, we go out there, and they invited a few media personalities there. So I walk in, and this guy sees me, and he says, oh my gosh, I love you. I love your show. I watch it every day. I wish everybody in America would listen to you. I think the country would be better off. I think you're amazing. And I was like, wow, thanks so much. And then he said, and you look great after the baby. And I thought, oh, he thinks I'm Megyn Kelly. She and I are very close, and when I told her this story, I admitted that I didn't tell him I wasn't. You know, mistaken identity can happen to anybody, and even as presidents, you can be humbled. When President Bush, I stayed till the very last day of the administration, and they went back to Texas, and this is what President Bush called the promised land, and Mrs. Bush called the afterlife. So they're heading back, and just remember that they'd had Secret Service protection for 16 years because he'd been governor for 2 terms and president for 2 terms, and they'll have Secret Service protection for the rest of their lives, as all former presidents do. And should, although that has to be re-upped all the time, and there's a little bit of a kerfuffle, but yes, former presidents and their families need protection. So he wants to get back into civilian life right away. So he wakes up the next morning in Texas, in his new home in Dallas, and he says to the Secret Service agent, I want to go to the hardware store today. So can we make that happen? So the Secret Service is like, okay, well, they can try that. So they wore khakis and sort of try to melt into the woodwork at the hardware store, and this guy walks by and he says to President Bush, anyone ever tell you you look like George W. Bush? And the president says, all the time. But then the guy said, sure must make you mad. And the president said, oh, you have no idea. And when you are making a decision on who you might support, of which the Democrats aren't really having to go through that right now, but the Republicans are, and it's an open primary, and you're trying to think, what attracts you to a candidate? Well, for me, early on with President Bush in 1998, really, it was his wit. I remember he was doing an interview with Barbara Walters for one of her specials, and she was interviewing both Al Gore and George W. Bush before the election. And she says to Governor Bush, Governor, if you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be? And he said, well, Barbara, I'm not a tree. I'm a bush. And I said, I'm for him. Right? Because there is something about being able to connect with people. You know, there's a lot of showmanship that does enter into politics, and some people are suited for that. Other people are policy wonks. Other people are like me, and I like the communications and explaining policy. And it really does take all kinds to be a part of our democracy. It's a participation sport. So sitting on the sidelines is really not an option for all of us. So I thought what I would do, because we're going to have a conversation, which I'm excited about, I just thought that I would give you a quick background as to how did I even end up as the White House press secretary? Because I get that question a lot, and honestly, if you looked back at my upbringing, you would never pick me out of a lineup and said, oh, she'll be the White House press secretary one day. I was born in Wyoming. My family is cattle ranchers since 1880s. My great-grandparents came from Italy, and then they met here. My great-grandmother and grandfather lived 3 miles from each other in Italy, but had never met. They actually meet in the Cambria coal camp area. And then they took advantage of the Great Homestead Act. And eventually that ranch grew, and my uncle and cousins still ranch that in Newcastle, Wyoming, which is about, if Wyoming were a clock, it's around 2 p.m., about 80 miles west of Mount Rushmore. And so that's where I spent my childhood. And a lot of people will ask me today, they'll say, oh, so where did you grow up in Texas? They just assume that I must have known the Bushes and that that's how I got my job. But I'll say, oh, no, I grew up in Wyoming. And then they'll say, oh, right, as if I knew the Cheneys and that's how I got my job. But my family was not involved in politics. Well, my grandfather eventually became a Republican county commissioner, but it was, everybody in Wyoming, everybody was a Republican. It wasn't like it was like an aberration, but it was part of public service. And so my grandfather really instilled that in me. But how I ended up getting involved in communications was that my dad was one of 3 boys, the first born on the ranch. And he knew from an early age that ranching wasn't for him. And he was the first person in his family to go to college. When I was in 3rd grade, we were living in Denver, Colorado, because he had gone a corporate route, and he was working for Western Farm Bureau Life Insurance Company. And I used to miss my dad terribly. And so he started a tradition with me where I had to read the Rocky Mountain News and the Denver Post every day before he got home from work. And I had to choose 2 articles to discuss before dinner. So he would come home, and that was father-daughter time. And I think back to that, and I always like to mention this in speeches, because if you are a parent or you're going to be a parent one day, if you're a grandparent, especially for younger women, one of the things I think that helped me so much eventually in my career was that I had this experience with a dominant male figure early on in my life. Yes, it was my father, but still, to express your opinion confidently and to have a safe place to think things through made all the difference for me, because I flash forward and I think about being on Marine One with President Bush. And in particular, I have one memory where he asked me my opinion about something, and I had an opinion that was different from the consensus, and it was not a popular opinion, and it was tough. And he looked at me and he said, "She's right." And I thought about how much confidence that actually takes for somebody to say to the President of the United States of America, "You're wrong, and you should change course," and to have that validation for him to say, "She's right." I think that really did start very early. It's not that you can't learn it later, but if you have the opportunity to help young people today to have that kind of confidence, it does make a difference. And so I think back to my great-grandparents, and I wish I could have met my great-grandfather. I did know my great-grandmother, and she didn't die until she was around 106 years old. But I always think that they walked into one side of the American dream, and I walked out of the other just about 100 years later. And that is remarkable, and that can only happen right now in the United States of America. And hopefully more countries will get to have that kind of experience. But communications came to me very early. I remember as a kid even being in the back seat of my parents, in the car when my parents were in the front seat, and if they were argued, I would get so nervous. And I immediately, even as a kid, I could instinctively say, "Oh, he shouldn't have said it that way." Or she should have waited and she should have said it then, because then they wouldn't fight. And I could figure out in my head how to manipulate conversations, and I could see things. I could see around corners. In fact, O'Reilly Factor. They had me come to O'Reilly Factor once a week. And this is on tape, I realize, so Bill, if you see this, understand. They wanted me to do Dana's top stories every week. And I thought, okay, well, that's fun. So I get to choose things that I think are top stories because I can see around corners. So I want to talk about the thing that I think is going to happen next week. Well, the thing about cable news is that Nobody's talking about next week until next week. So I would pitch all of these stories. For example, when Rand Paul was, there was a time when Rand Paul was high up in the polls, like had better numbers even than Donald Trump. But he went against American consensus on national security when it came to ISIS. And I wanted to do the story, one of my top stories, I wanted to say Rand Paul has jumped the shark. And they said, well, he hasn't. I said, no, he has. And the media and the polling will catch up to this a week later. Because there's something about working in this field. So it's not just instincts, but after a time, you start to realize that you can see what is going to happen. So what I thought I would do now is just talk a little bit about some of the things that I learned along the way that helped me be a better public communicator. Number one, President Bush set an important tone. So if you're in a position of leadership, or if you're an elected leader, or if you're going to be a communications person that needs to work with a principal, you have to ensure total trust and loyalty between the two of you. Because I could see what was happening in the future, and I had a good sense of what he was thinking, and the only reason I did that is because he gave me total access to him. I got to sit in on the meetings. I didn't always speak up, though probably more than I should have. No, that's not true. Always speak up if you feel you need to. But I got to be there all the time. And he made it very clear to everybody in the administration that Dana's calls get returned first. Okay, that I was to have everything that I needed to be successful at the White House podium. I was a spokesperson. I never thought of myself as a spokesperson for the Republican Party. Absolutely not. I was a spokesperson for the United States of America. And there is dignity and grace that comes to that position. And it is so important to keep that in mind, because you're working to not only defend the President of the United States and advocate his policies or hers in the future, you are also responsible for protecting the access of the press to the government. And I used to think of that as sort of a 50-50 deal. Yes, reporters would irritate me. And in the mornings, I'd look at headlines and think, how could that have been? And I'm sure that maybe some of you have been in that situation where if you take a complicated policy matter and you distill it through the process and it gets filtered and it goes through the colander and it comes out and you think, well, they totally missed the mark. Don't just blame the reporter. I always felt like, well, the onus is on us to work harder to help reporters understand it so that we are happier in the morning when the story shows up. Or now, I guess, on the blog, whenever it shows up. But the president gave me that confidence to know that my calls would be returned first. I would also get asked sometimes, well, how could you remain so calm at the podium? And one of the ways I did that, if you read my book, I'm not going to reveal it here because it's kind of embarrassing, it's not very gracious. There was one way that with a couple of reporters that I would deal with it that was probably a little bit more Wyoming than necessary, but nobody knew about it until I wrote my book. But I also would make sure that I had good relationships with the press. We were personal friends. Now, I always think of the reporters as, I say friends, I was aware that they had a story to turn in every day. These aren't necessarily people you're going to invite to Christmas dinner, but I never think of the press as an enemy. The press should be considered as a check on your administration or on your organization or of the government office that you work in. And as the press starts to change, and we were just talking earlier about how few reporters are even covering local and state races anymore or local and state issues. So again, we can't change that. We can't wish for more reporters to be there. We have to deal with what we are given, so you have to figure out then how to be creative and get around that. Being friendly with reporters actually really helped me at one point, kind of just on a personal note. The press secretary job is really fun. It's a great opportunity. I never thought it would be dangerous. But of course, when you're around the President of the United States, the chances are that there is something going to could happen at any moment. That's why you have good security. Well, I ended up with an injury, an actual physical injury in December of 2008 when we were in Iraq. It was a secret trip. We'd been on the ground for about 8 hours, which made the Secret Service nervous because when you do an unplanned trip, that means that you haven't been on the ground for a long time planning it. So the Secret Service knew that after about 4 hours, they are itchy. They want to get the principal, the President of the United States, out of there because it gets to be too dangerous. But we're about 8 hours in, and the president was going to do a press conference with the prime minister of Iraq. And what happened? The shoes that were thrown at the president's head, remember, and he could thank God he had instincts. He was like, whoa. And he looked so bemused. But if you go on YouTube and you listen to that, you'll hear somebody scream in the background. And that was actually me. Because I was sitting sort of where Raphael is now, and there was a interpreter who was actually our CIA briefer as well, because on these trips you had to double. I got to double as press secretary and makeup artist. He was CIA briefer and interpreter. We were sitting there, and the shoes were thrown, and the Secret Service agent, who was about 6'5", was standing behind the microphone, and he lunged forward to get the president, but he swung that boom mic around, and it caught me right here. And I ended up having a black eye. Well, I didn't even know this. Apparently, if you get hit in the face, you should not lie down on your side that night, because then you'll get a black eye, but only if you played hockey would you have known that. But I was injured. It hurt. It wasn't broken, but it was pretty bad. And I remember the president saw me afterwards. He said, "I saw you crying, but I thought it was just because the guy threw his shoe at me." And I said, "Oh, sir, I love you, but I grew up in Wyoming, and I'm a little tougher than that." I found a little quiet spot on the floor of Air Force One on the flight from Baghdad to Kabul. When I woke up in the morning, I had this huge black eye. And the president, he felt terrible. And Mrs. Bush wasn't with us on that trip. So when we went to see President Karzai, the president said, "Walk with me." So I did. And the Karzai, who was a terrible person, but very charming. And one of the things I write in my book is something that General Powell told me one time when I was admiring him. He said, "Beware of dictators that speak very good English." Okay? But anyway, so we walk up, and the Karzai is so worried about me, and he says, I said, "Don't worry, sir, you should see the other guy." But the reason I bring that up is that it's just a small thing, but we had White House reporters and photographers on the flight with us, but no one took a picture of me with my black eye. And I found out later why, is that they said, the 3 photographers, they said, "Oh, we thought we shouldn't do that to you because you've been so good to us." Now, when we landed back in Washington, nobody else had been in that pack, so you can see it. There are pictures of it. But I always think back to having that kind of relationship with the press, that they would protect you personally, is something that we should all strive to do, because we live in the greatest country in the world. And yes, we can have tough discussions and big debates, but we really need to start remembering that we're all pulling for the same thing. I mean, everybody wants a strong national security. Everybody wants a good education for people. People would love to have a clean environment. But if you have just different ideas of how to get there, we should respect that. And I write about civility in my book a lot as well. One other thing I just want to mention about public policy communication is that always remember, you don't have to know every single bit of the issue. In the financial crisis of 2008, I was the press secretary. And in the months before that, a lot of people like to be on television. Okay, so you can find people at the Treasury Department. They'd be like, I'll do CNBC today. I'll do this. They like to be on TV. When the financial crisis happened, you couldn't find them. But what I did is I knew how to get the answers. I didn't know what a credit default swap was. I don't have any money, right? So I have a 401k, right? So the money I didn't really understand all these complicated things. What I did know is that I was a journalist by training. So I would go and I had my deputies. The financial crisis is one example, but let me give you another. Let's just say we are dealing with an intelligence matter and a defense matter. I'm thinking of one in particular, but I cannot reveal what it is, but I can describe it. So I knew I was going to get a question at the briefing regarding this national security issue. So what I decided to do to make sure that I was confident that I had the right answer that was accurate is I asked my deputies, I had 3, I said, you call State Department, you call DOD, you call CIA. And ask them the same question. And if we meet back here in an hour and they all had the same answer, we're fine. But typically, I could find a discrepancy. And then I would say, well, I'm not saying it. So I'm not going to go to the podium and I'm not going to say something on behalf of the United States of America that is not true or that is a problem. So everyone needs to go back to the drawing board, and I'd call the National Security Office and say, there's a problem here. So I didn't have the answer, but I knew how to spot trouble. And it also, in many ways, it would force the discussion to be, oh, well, I hadn't thought about that. Because I would never, how I see around corners, I would never, on Monday, I wouldn't prepare for Monday's briefing. I'd prepare for Thursday's briefing. I would watch the State Department. I'd read the transcript of the State Department briefing every day because that would tell me what I was going to get asked on Thursday. and I could be prepared for that. It is an all-consuming job, but there were ways that I learned to be innovative and creative. That would be one thing I would point out in this lecture. The second thing is make sure you have that access to the principal and his total confidence, his or her total confidence, to make sure that your calls are returned first and that you are supported in that role. And the third thing is to remember that reporters have a job to do as well. The last thing I'm going to leave you with before I sit down with Raphael for the conversation was I mentioned civility. And I love to tell this story because I feel like people are missing this in Washington. I had a great experience in Washington, D.C. I had friends from both sides of the aisle, and I really felt that it was a great career opportunity, and it really enhanced my life. One of the things I write in the civility chapter is that Democrats are people too. And I explain this, and I don't say that to other Democrats. I basically say that to people on my right who think that maybe I'm wrong on that point, but I'm right. Democrats are people too. And I tell them about some of my friends, and I talk about Joe Biden, how one time at an event for the Broadcasting Board of Governors, he gave me this huge hug. He says, "Oh gosh, why won't you come over to our side? I listen to you every day." And he's got me wrapped up in a big hug. And I said, "Oh, sir, I listen to you every day too, so that I can make fun of it later." And he laughed, and we just got along great. And I was sad to see him decide to not run, although I'm glad that he made the right decision for himself. But the second thing is, in 2005, I was junior Birdman, deputy press secretary, but I got invited to the Gridiron Dinner. This is a big awards dinner that the press puts on every year. It's like a 110-year-old dinner. And it's supposed to be off the record, where reporters and sources can just have a fun night out, talk about anything. You can actually get a lot of business done there too. But I had never been invited because it's kind of a big deal, and it's a big American event, but there's not a spouse ticket, so my husband stayed back. And I got to sit across the table from Barack Obama. And he was the junior senator from Illinois. He'd been in town about 2 weeks, he'd just been elected. And the whole city was abuzz about Barack Obama, especially from his DNC speech in 2004, which was here, right? In California? I think so, Los Angeles. So everyone's excited, and he and I laughed our butts off for 4 hours. We had so much fun. He took me over to meet Michelle Obama, and we just got along great. And I got home that night, and my husband said, "So how was your event?" And I said, "Peter, I got to tell you, I got to sit across from Barack Obama, and we had such a great time, and I got to tell you, I think he could be president in like 20 years. So 3 years later, I was the press secretary, and he was the nominee to be the Democratic nominee to be president of the United States. And it was a financial crisis, and so it was big. Talk about a policy communication challenge. McCain suspended his campaign. Barack Obama came to the cabinet room, and I was the last to file in. And Obama was shaking hands with everybody. And I am humble enough that I never think anyone will remember me. So I went to reintroduce myself, and he says, "Oh, Dana Perino," and he gives me this huge hug. And of course, I'm kind of blushing because I'm like, wow, he even knows who I am? That's great. And I said, "Senator, you may not remember," and then he interrupted me, and he said, "Not remember? That was my favorite night in all of Washington." And I sat down, and the deputy chief of staff leaned over, and he said, "What was that all about?" And I said, "Well, I'll tell you later, but I just might vote for him too." I didn't. All right, I'm going to end it there so we can have a chat.
I really enjoyed listening to you, the lessons about sort of what you need to do. And to me, when I listen to you, there's the communication piece, but there's also how do you serve as a senior advisor, right? And the message about, innovate, create, spot trouble in advance, and tell people. It's a critical thing. Do you see that as something that's going on regularly? Like you look at the Hillary campaign, a lot of her troubles, I think that didn't happen.
They don't have it. No one on the Hillary campaign is paranoid.
She's paranoid.
She's kind of paranoid, right. But her team, up until now, right, they're paranoid about the wrong things. So when it comes to the media, because the media typically sides with them, right? It's like, now Hillary Clinton's team would not say that. They would say that they're under attack, even from the New York Times every day. But if you're a Republican and you look at their press, you think, you got it made. Like this, it's so easy for you. And if you look at the CNBC debate last night, I think it was, the headline out of the CNBC debate was how terrible the moderators were. And I was on a plane coming here, so I couldn't see it. I was just following it on Twitter. And I thought, well, maybe it's just the right complaining about moderators, but it ended up actually being the left. So I do think that there is a need to be thinking ahead on behalf of your principal, because your principal has a lot of things on their mind. So you need to be seeding the ground early on. And especially when it comes to policy communication, one thing I see as a troubling trend, it's not just on the campaign side of things, it's on the media side of things. So is it frustrating to you when you watch television and you see strategists who are, about 23 years old and never worked on a campaign? I have young women that come to me and say, I'd love to co-host, I'd love to fill in for you on the 5. I'm like, well, okay, that's great, but you need to have something to say. You need to have some experience in order to build upon that. And so you can't just go and be a communications expert on a campaign without having to go through a little bit of hard work. It takes a little bit of time and to be steeped into those issues. And the reason I say that is that the best communicators are policy wonks at heart. So it might be kind of boring to have to learn about credit default swaps, but it's really important and that you actually understand the policy, because then you can take your communication skills and use a filter and to say, okay, once you fully understand the policy, I would always call it, I had 2 tests, my grandma test and my sister test. So on my grandma test, it would be, how can I explain, I hate using this word credit default swap, but we'll keep going. On the credit default swap, how can I explain what that means to my grandmother without having any follow-up questions from her?
Well, that's hard.
Yeah, it's hard. But you think about on television, or if you're in a soundbite situation, you have one shot. And so you might have only 20 seconds. On our show, on the 5, we have 5 people. We're all very opinionated. We are accomplished. And we have a lot to say, and we are not shrinking violets. If a segment is 5 minutes long and you have one soundbite, that means you probably have about 45 seconds each in order to make a point. So you better figure out how to make it really, really good. The other thing that's happening is the way that we communicate and the way we have to accommodate as communicators from a policy standpoint. So everybody now is reading on their mobile devices. This is the media consumption is that way. So when you can't send out a press release with 5 paragraphs full of text. It has to be shorter and smarter and more concise, which means that you have to be a better policy wonk to be a better communicator. But you can't lose the importance of anything in the translation. So the difficulties for communicators have actually increased with technology, and in a lot of ways. Mike McCurry, have you ever had him here?
No, we haven't had him.
He would be a great speaker for you. Mike McCurry was the press secretary for Bill Clinton. And he says that by the time I even got there at 2005, that the job was completely different. Not the fundamental principles of the job, but the tactics of the job. And I would actually say between me and Josh Earnest, that the technology has increased so much, again, that they know how to take advantage of it in a good way in terms of communicating directly to people. But one thing that really bothered me early on in the administration was they tended to push the press away. And I thought, why do you do that? The press is on your side. And the White House press, you might remember this, the White House reporters were getting really angry because they couldn't have access to the president for even little things, even signing a bill. They wouldn't let the photographers in. And I thought, well, he never takes a bad picture. Why would you just let the photographers come in, take a quick picture, it takes them 10 minutes, and it's so easy. You have to give a little when you're on the government side. Let the press in. Again, they're the check on your system, but they're also the way that you communicate to people. Well, my one example on this that I always point out, the dangers of the technology and how we decide to use it in a democracy, was the WNBA champions got to come to the White House for a picture and a meeting with the president, and then they got to play some hoops with him. Well, that's typically a thing that as press secretary, you would let the pool, meaning it's the press pool, you would let them come in for 10 minutes, get some color, get some pictures, write their story up, send them on their merry way, and continue to have fun. But in this case, it was in April of 2009, the White House refused to let any reporters in to take a picture. Later on that day, around 3 o'clock, the White House issued a little video that showed President Obama playing hoops with the WNBA team, and guess what? He never missed a shot. It's not possible. And it's the little things like that. And one of the things I told the reporters who would call and complain to me, I'm like, well, one, I have nothing to do with this anymore. You guys are going to have to fight your own battles. But what I told the press is, you have to fight for every inch of ground that you have. And if you cede ground to the government, any government, Republican or Democrat, if you cede ground as the media, it's impossible to get it back.
You're never going to get it back.
Right.
No, that's exactly right. So do you think that that this administration, I was a part of the administration, and I was frustrated with the White House because the communications function was so controlled.
Right.
And there was very little ability to really have discourse with people. I mean, you'd have to go to bars and sit in booths in the corner to talk
Right.
to, that sort of stuff.
In disguise.
Yeah,
I know what you mean.
a black guy in D.C., you're usually fairly anonymous. But do you think that contributed to some of the challenges that the administration has had in terms of budget
I think
issues?
there's a couple of things. Over time, communicators have tried to lock things down. And I understand that tendency, because you want to control the message, controlling the message. The interesting thing is that might have worked okay in 1990s and into 2000, but with the way people get information today and gather information, it doesn't fit with the changing times. I've always been amazed at how little President Obama uses his cabinet. I mean, you couldn't name most of the cabinet right now. If I asked, I'm not going to put anybody on the spot, but think about it. Can you name the Treasury Secretary? Commerce Secretary? Okay, you got the Commerce one. Commerce Secretary, you got her? You guys are in the know.
So a bunch of these folks, they follow the news.
They follow the news. Okay, this is the wrong audience for me to do this little pop quiz,
if
obviously.
we went out to the metro.
But you know what I mean? Like, even in Washington, you can't, because they're not utilized. And I think one of the reasons they're not utilized is that the White House tries to control everybody. When I think, well, why wouldn't you use them? These are experts. These are amazing people. Put them out there. Utilize them as your army, as your resource. But I think there's a tendency, not just in government. This is happening in corporations too. I recently, when I left the White House, I, for a little while, did PR, and I did media training for a guy who was going to become a CEO of a major energy company. He'd been with the company 27 years. And you want to know how he succeeded? Because he never said a word. He'd never once done an interview with anyone, so there was no record of him. So now all of a sudden he's going to be the CEO of a major energy company, an international major energy company, and he's never once done a media interview. And he gave me a lot of time to do media training, but I always thought, you have these smart people who are really good and should be utilized, and so I think I wish that there could be a change. Mike McCurry also has a very good point about, we are to a point now where reporters seem to think that the only thing that happens in government on any given day happens at the White House, when most of the things happening in government is happening all across at the agencies. Right. And typically, up until kind of more recently, there were actual reporters who covered that agency in the building. So HUD had reporters in the building, so did transportation. And now the only three buildings that still do that are Justice Department, DOD, and the White House. I believe the Treasury reporters have even left. And partly that's because the reporters get moved out. There's budget issues. There's a part of that, but it's also a desire to kind of control. And I don't like that. I feel like most of the news is happening at all of the agencies, especially in the last year of a White House, any White House. And they plant little things that will come to bear later because they want to have their legacy stick.
No, that's right. It's interesting to hear you talk about people's engagement with the media, because I'm trying to do that here on campus. We have a lot of experts, professors who know a lot about things, and to get them to engage so that the knowledge becomes more generally known.
Yeah.
But what I found is that people fear the media a lot, and they're very wary of being misrepresented. And if something bad goes in a media context, just in the world, right? It's not over lunch or something like that. And so how do you deal with that? You interview a lot of folks. You're on Fox, right? So people on the left, if they're going to be on Fox, they're already, the back is up. How do you work in that environment where you know that one side is, the person you're dealing with is going to be guarded? How do you get
I'm a little bit different in that I'm an analyst on a show where we don't have guests. And so I am not interviewing people, but I am, every once in a while I fill in for Greta Van Susteren at 7 p.m. And I've been pleased that, at least for me, I get some pretty good guests and feedback from both sides, but I think partly that's because of my experience. That I know, having worked in Washington, I know that it's not always black and white. That I try to always put myself in somebody else's shoes, and I always want them to know that they're welcome and that I listen to them and I never interrupt them. That's like number one. Well, unless they're going on and on. Then you have to like, come on, we only have 3 minutes here. But I understand the fear, and part of the thing that I talk about in my book is, this is more from a mentoring perspective, but it's being risk averse. We actually in America are still a pioneering spirit. We want to move forward. That's what presidential elections are about. For example, with Jeb Bush, yes, you have great experience as the governor of Florida 8 years ago, but people want to know where you're going from here. Like, okay, that's fine, that's in the past, that's good, but where would you take us? Where do you want to go? And so he has to take some risk. But people are afraid of risk because then the media misconstrues it, and then you think that you're in a box, and then you're all controlled, and you can't just be yourself. I think one of the ways to deal with that is, it's a little bit baby steps, right? So I wouldn't necessarily throw one of your professors, for example, on to do an interview with Sean Hannity on their first time. But would they do an interview with Martha McCallum and Bill Hemmer, the 9 a.m. show, or your 6 a.m. show? Like, absolutely, that show is excellent. So I think it's a little bit baby steps in finding the places to go. One of the problems is if people aren't willing to talk to each other, but that concern I have about people assuming that the other side's motives, for some reason, that their intentions aren't good, but that's actually just not true. In America, we actually all want to, again, we want to get to the same place, we just have different ideas of how to get there.
So on that one, the media, cable news, is ratings driven.
Yes.
Right. So
yes.
You do hear a viewpoint that, if you're going to actually get ratings, you have to have a viewpoint, and you have to have a perspective and go your own agenda. And it may not actually be the political agenda; it may be something different than that. And so so on some level, I think people are not totally wrong in that they should have some expectations that they're going to try to get pulled in certain places or exposed in those.
Well, and partly that's the way just news consumption. This is when, as a communicator, if you're working to try to communicate things, you have to understand how news consumers are spending their day. So it used to be when my dad got home and we would do the Rocky Mountain News and the Denver Post, and then we would watch, we lived in Denver, and for some reason, Brokaw and Jennings were on at the same time. Mm-hmm. And we were from the West, and my dad was born in South Dakota, so we kind of were a Brokaw family. And then we would watch Dan Rather, usually, and then we would move on to our local news. Like we had a ton of news, but it was because my dad would rush home because he wanted to know what happened that day. Today, by the time people get home, they already know what happened today, and so now they want to know, what do people I respect or that I want to hear from, what do they think about what happened today? That is a different way to deal with a news cycle that I don't think communicators fully appreciate. You're not going to get a Peter Jennings broadcast at 8 p.m. anymore because people are tired of that. I already know that happened this morning. So I want to know now what people think about it. It's sort of like when you read the newspaper, if you start at the beginning, you get to the back, then you get the opinion section. And sort of at the end of the day, you get the opinion section, but opinion sells. And so, yes, it does matter if you can have a viewpoint. I always feel like the best way for me to win an argument is to have more facts than anybody else and to use my opponent's language to make my point. And actually, Greg Gutfeld, my co-host, who has a new book out this week, it's called How to Be Right. It's one of the things he always says. I could get Juan Williams to agree with me on just about everything. And then at the end of it, he'll say, wait, what did I just do? I'm like, well, because you just use the language, because you realize that, like, you want to have good schools, right, Juan? Yes. It's like cross-examination. You walk them down the path, and like, therefore we agree. It's like, oh, we agree. Wow. Then the commercial break. It's like, wait, did I just agree? I was like, yeah, you agreed with me, because it makes sense. But I'm opinionated, but I am also consensus-driven. So my personal approach is to try to show that, no, actually, let's all try to move in the same direction.
So do you think that so when people talk about the political space now, the notion of consensus is something that everyone decries. We don't have consensus. We don't compromise. We don't have a middle.
Give no ground.
Right. Do you feel like, first of all, do you view that's true? And then second, do you see a pathway to get us to a different environment?
Yes, I think it's true, and I think the path is hard to see. But I think it's there under a bunch of brush. And it just needs to be cleared out. So just this morning in Washington, D.C., we elected a new Speaker of the House, and it's Paul Ryan. Now, I will say I loved John Boehner. I always have. I've known him. I first started on Capitol Hill as little baby in 1994. Just kidding. I'm feeling a little bit old now. I'm like, wow, I knew him 20 years ago. John Boehner, I thought, was a great speaker for the times, except for times change, and so you have to accept change. You kind of move on with it. Especially on the right, the fragmentation is strong. Now, the left doesn't give any ground either, but they all work together, so you don't think that there's any
fracture.
There's no fracturing. It's like if you were going to play Red Rover, you want to be on the Democrat side, because they will never, ever break. Even if they disagree, they will hold on and swallow their pride and handle it. On the right, a couple of things have happened. One, you don't have one leader that is pushing in the same direction. You had that with George W. Bush in 2000, 2004, even 2008, although weaker certainly by then. The Democrats have had President Obama, and he is leading the party, and he's moved the party a little bit, but everybody, they follow him. On the right, it's open season, and it is a big tent, and there's everybody there. Now, you have a certain segment that it surprises me that even I have been called a rhino, a Republican in name only, because I'm willing to say, well, they have a point there. Then all of a sudden, I'm a bad guy. But those same people that would attack me from the far right, now they would say they're for Donald Trump. Like, well, how can both things be true? But logic is not playing a role here. I think that it is possible that Paul Ryan could bring an ability to bring people together, because I'm going to give you one example why. Think back to the last budget deal. So boring, but people in this room, since you know who the Commerce Secretary is, you probably followed this. Who was it that got that budget deal done? It was Patty Murray on the Democrat side and Paul Ryan on the Republican side. So yes, he knows how to do that. Will his right allow him room to do that? The great thing about Paul Ryan is that he comes to this not because he was dying to be Speaker of the House, but because he had to lean in to that moment, and he has his head screwed on straight. I also love it that he was the first Speaker of the House to say, I will do this, but I want to let you know my family comes first. And even some people on the right, even women on the right, were criticizing him. I'm like, no, this is good. This is exactly what we want to hear. And remember, when you're in political communication, this is such an important point, you're not always speaking directly to the American public. Okay, you have multiple audiences when you're communicating. You have to keep that in mind. Do you think that when he said that message was meant for you and me? It wasn't. There was one person in the audience for that message from him, and it was his wife. Okay, so yes, all of us heard it, but sometimes you have to talk directly to them. President Bush used to say this. He said to us, to Ed Gillespie and me, you're really good communicators to the American people. But we have multiple audiences, and sometimes you're going to want me to say something to the American people that I'm going to realize our allies, if they hear me say that and they sense any sort of equivocation, they might walk. And our enemies, they might hear that and they might ramp up on us. And our military might have a problem, a morale problem, if they heard something like that is good for the American people to hear. So you have to understand, I will never do that. Of course, Ed was like, sign me up. I want to work for somebody like that. But keep in mind there are multiple audiences in each communication. Now you have to understand how one might affect the other, but sometimes you're only communicating to a very small group of people.
So you said at the very beginning this was a fairly straightforward job. You kind of managed it. And then through the course of our conversation, you've said you need to be an expert on every policy. You need to...
or know where the experts are.
but then talk to them and get up to
Yes,
speed.
true.
And then fact check and stress test anything that comes to you, and then communicate to 17 different constituencies.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like that easy of a job to me.
No.
So how did you, when you got the position, how did you manage that? What were the tricks that allowed you to keep doing it, to not get worn down, and to continually stay up on things? Because it seems like that's like a tremendously difficult thing to do.
It was. They call the press secretary job the second toughest job in Washington. And there's a reason for that. I never stopped studying. I will tell you, I'm going to say something that happens at the end, but I'll go back and explain why. I actually didn't handle that well physically. And I am very open about that in my book. And if I had to, we get the question, what would you have done differently? It's not that I would have punched back against NBC harder or done X or Y differently. Like I actually predicted the Dubai ports debacle when I was a deputy, and I didn't speak up because I was told it would never be a story. And I thought, well, I'm just a junior Birdman. Why would I know any better? I bring it up 3 times. I'm told no. That exploded, became a huge issue. Yes, I might have gone back and changed that. But the one thing I would definitely do different is I would have taken much better care of my health. That was personal choices that I made that ate away at a lot of things. I got a ringing in my ear that lasted 2.5 years, and sometimes it was so loud I couldn't even hear what the reporters were saying. I got a numbness in my arm from my elbow to my finger. This is because Blackberries were new back then. Feels like ancient history, but they were fairly new. And because I could write an entire press release, with my thumbs, over time that caused a problem. I got migraines, my back, all sorts of problems were all self-imposed. But aside from that, the way that I did it was I felt like I had an excellent team, okay? And I would always imagine, is President Bush watching me right now? And if he would not be pleased with something I said, or if he read something in the paper, if he would be disappointed in me, then that would be devastating, in my opinion. So that job is so all-consuming that you work from 4 a.m., that's typically when I woke up, or when I got up. My husband was funny. He used to snore more now, I guess, or maybe I sleep better now, but I would fall asleep at 10:30, like on the dot. I'd fall asleep, and my alarm would be at 4:15. But if I woke up at like 2 or something, I would replay that briefing in my head. I'd think about all the things the next day. So if he woke me up snoring, I was not kind. I'm like, ugh, and I get so mad. And he told this guy from China that was working with him, he is in the medical and surgical device business, and he said, oh, it's really hard when I snore, I get this pain in my side. And the Chinese doctor said, oh, I never heard of that. And he's like, yeah, it hurts so bad. He's like, really? He's like, yeah, it's my wife's elbow. He used to love that story. But so what I would do every day, I'd structure my day through, I'd wake up around 4:15. I had a really great deputy named Tony Fratto, and Don Stewart worked for McConnell. And we were all up really early, and we would read in the papers, and like, did you see this? Can you believe that? Oh my gosh, the New York Times, are you gonna call them? I'll call them. And we would just start early on. The other thing I did is I tried to read as much as possible. And if you watch The Five, they kind of make fun of me because I read so much, and I send them all articles to read because I feel like every discussion is better if everyone has read more. So I would try to read everything that I possibly could. I started getting clips from my team around 5:15. We met at 7:15 every morning, the deputies, and we would talk about things that were going on. And then I went to senior staff at 7:30. And interesting thing about the Bush senior staff meeting, I don't know how Obama's team runs it, but I was a press secretary and Candy Wolf was the legislative director, and we were two women on, not the only two women, we were 2 women on the teams sitting on opposite sides of the table, and we always went first because Josh Bolton would say the president thinks they're the most important. So you go first and then you. He'd already had his national security briefing by then, so we were next. And then it was just like a regular source of meetings and in the hallway, and I was just hyper-focused all the time on being paranoid. How could I make sure that we were going to have the best possible day? I did have a very good team, and I trusted them. And then what I did with my younger staff, I think this is really important. I'm really proud of them, actually. every young person that worked for me is now in a really great job. Emily Larimore, who just sent an email this morning with her Gmail address because she's leaving her job, is because she became the spokesperson for the Speaker of the House. She worked for John Boehner. Wow. And I look at all of them, and for the young women in particular, I could train them like that. But I would do things like I would let them sit in with me on a conference call. And I wouldn't hide the fact that they were there. I would let the other person on the phone know that I have this junior person here with me. They're just here to observe. Okay, that's fine. I would also blind copy them on my responses to reporters so that they could see that how the kind of language that I used, how I structured an email, how I would do things. The other thing I did to keep, how the bureaucracy can slow you down? Actually, this is a point I want to make in the speech, but I wanted to get to this part, so I'm glad I remembered. Bureaucracy, it can be so frustrating. It can slow everything down, and communicators are the casualty of that. So did you ever have to do a White House staffing? Okay, it's a very annoying thing. Let's just say that you want to do one statement by the president about an issue. So you write the statement, and then it goes to the White House staffing process, which means that every office in the White House gets a chance to look at it, comment on it, and then it comes back to you, and you have to reconcile the changes or call somebody and say, no, I'm not going to add that, and you have to explain why. Finally, it goes to staff secretary. This can take hours, sometimes days. And as communicators, you have to be innovative and deal with the times. Well, knowing that the president had confidence in me, I came up with something new. There used to be a thing called the statement by the president. I changed it to the statement by the press secretary, which I would write. I'd run it by a couple of people. Then that's my words, but I would be faster than everybody else. The other thing I learned to do was how to deal with my morning better. Because I love my mornings, and I like to get up early, but I don't like to deal with crap in the morning. And typically what was happening is I'd wake up and I get all these calls from reporters who are trying to do their live shots in the morning. So they might want to know, well, why is he going to Norfolk, Virginia today? And why this audience for this speech? And all those sort of little things. So I decided to do something called a night note. And every night before I left, for a while I did it, and then I transferred it to Emily, who became the speaker's spokesperson. She was responsible for sending a little night note. And we made it short and cute. So we'd be like, hey, here's a way to make your morning better. And we would pretend like it was making their morning better. It was actually making our morning better. And we would say, here's the speech, this is where the speech is going to be. This is why we're going to this. The president has actually never been to Norfolk, Virginia, so that's why this is kind of neat. He's going to stop by and have lunch with so-and-so. He's going to meet with wounded warriors. Blah, blah, blah. Do you know this saved so much time? So it was like, we called it an ounce of prevention. As communicators, always think like, as an ounce of prevention, how can you make your life a little bit easier? So it was a win-win for me and for the press.
So it's really interesting. I mean, that's a great answer because it touched on so many things. The bureaucracy,
yep.
The one thing I didn't fully appreciate is how we're structurally set up to really not get anything done. That there are so many gatekeepers who can basically just stop it, and just delay means stop. And then the issue about the health. So when I left the administration, I was not sleep. I could not sleep longer than 3 hours at a time. My blood pressure went up. I don't think people appreciate the physical toll and the sacrifice that anyone who's doing this is doing. And it's something that I think is important to keep in mind. Mm-hmm. And then I had to chuckle to myself when you said you read a lot, because I'm the least well-read person in my staff, and they're always yelling at me, you need to read more, we're going to make you read more, we're going to do stuff. And it actually does make you better, right? It really does improve your ability to talk. So while people decry the end of the book, please keep reading, because it does actually.
And we're really in a golden age of columnists right now. I think that we can look back. There was sort of like in the 60s, there were some great columnists, and then I feel like right now you can read, again, it's not, you already know what happened because you read the other parts of the paper, but to read 750 words based on somebody who is a columnist, and I love all that they've done. That's one of the reasons that I worked on the books for Charles Krauthammer and Peggy Noonan. I did collections of their work because you have to come up with a topic every week, and you have to get it down to 750 meaningful words. It's really hard, but you can read all sorts of different opinion, and you can, after a while, if you're going to read, I know that on Tuesdays, I'll see Bret Stephens and Bill McGurn. I love Fridays. Fridays, you get Kim Strassel and Charles Krauthammer and Matthew Continetti. And I know, I keep those people in mind so that I can follow them, and I always want to make sure I cannot forget on Sunday, I want to read George Will, or Fred Hyatt writes on Mondays. He's the editorial writer for the Washington Post. And by being able to follow them. The other thing it really helps with is networking events. I write chapter 5 is about is mentoring, and the most important thing, especially for young women, is to really work to build a network. And networking events are kind of annoying when you go to places like, well, not annoying, but it's kind of intimidating. You don't like to go because you're like, oh, hi, I'm Dana Perino, what do you do? And it's like awkward. But if you have read more that day, there's always, if you are well read, it doesn't just have to be books, but you could say, oh, I saw an article about your hometown of Yellowstone National Park, whatever it might be. But to have an ability to say, oh my gosh, I just read something about that. And then as a follow-up, I just got an article the other day sent from someone. I used to mix up sports metaphors at the podium. One time I did it just because of a joke. Another time I did it, I didn't know what rope-a-dope meant, but I used it in a way that actually made it look like I knew what I was talking about. So people always would laugh. I would say take a knee. That's one of my favorites. I actually do know what that means. 3-point stance, that's what it was. The one I messed up, 3-point stance. I thought that was a basketball thing. Obviously it's not, it's a football thing. And just the other day, I got an article sent to me, old-fashioned, cut out of the magazine, and it was from a friend of mine who worked in the White House with me, now is in a sports marketing in Florida, and he said, I thought you would like this. And it was about how politicians tend to use sports metaphors based on the season. Okay, so like you use baseball metaphors right now work really well. Football in the spring, you kind of might get hockey in the winter. Sorry, hockey is the longest season. You could use that, like that's like a 10-month thing. You could use all of that. Yes. But I just find that we are in this really great age of writing, and you have to kind of look for them sometimes. But find some columnists that you like and try to follow them for a while, and it really is enriching.
Hello, my name is Ted Green. Can you tell us who won last night's debate, who lost, and does it matter?
Yes. Before I left yesterday to come out here, I was on the 5, and I had said to my co-host, I said, you might actually see tonight the Republicans band together to go against the moderators. And it was an instinct that I had, not because I thought it was going to be terrible, but I realized that I just had a hunch. So then on the plane last night, the only 2 channels that were working were ESPN and Fox Sports, so I couldn't watch CNBC. And I don't blame the Republican National Committee for thinking that CNBC would be a great host of a debate. I mean, most CEOs watch CNBC. A lot of Republicans like to go on CNBC. It's smart television. It's about the economy. Like, how could it go wrong? But that went really badly. I think consensus is that the 3 best of last night were Rubio, Cruz, and Christie. I think Rand Paul continues to fade. Carly probably shored up her position, I guess, for a while. I think Trump and Carson, in a way, they sort of fade in these debates. But the last 2 debates, well, not the first, I'm sorry. In the second debate on CNN, both Trump and Carson saw their numbers fall a little bit. Now, they're so high up that it kind of doesn't really matter. But I don't think that either of them had a great debate. But I think that Rubio had a good one. I think Jeb did not have a good one. And there's an article this morning by Ron Fournier, who wrote that a lot of running for president is being a showman. And if you're an introvert and you're not a showman, it's really hard in today's modern world if you have a lot of competition to actually pull it off. So there's another debate coming up November 10th, and that's a Fox Business debate. I don't think you're going to see anybody drop out between today and November 10th. It's only like 14 days, so you can keep a campaign going that long. But after that, I really hope the field winnows down, because I can't read all their press releases anymore. It's just too much.
Well, it is difficult, and the longer this goes on, it's going to be harder to coalesce. I think.
And I don't think it's smart to go into big campaign debt or personal debt if it's clear that you're not going to run. I mean, I really think that bottom tier, the bottom 4 that are running, can we all just be honest? They are never going to be president of the United States this time around. I'm sorry, they're not going to win. I'm not saying they couldn't win in the future, that they can do whatever they want. But right now, they're not going to be president of the United States, so I really do feel like we could winnow this field down. I actually think the American people already have.
I think that's true.
This is a little bit in the weeds, but something you said was just really intriguing to me about the press, or the representatives from the various departments were now not really coming to the White House press conferences. Why not, and where did they go? What made that happen?
A couple of, well, actually what I'll have a chance to clarify. So at the cabinet agencies, it used to be that each of the cabinet agencies had reporters that actually worked in those buildings. Now they typically don't. You might have one transportation reporter, but they work out of the Washington Post bureau, at headquarters. So it's not that they don't ever go over to the transportation department or go to the hearings. It's just that there used to be a more robust journalism presence at all the different cabinet agencies. And for example, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, they have really big issues on their plate right now. And there used to be reporters even at those smaller agencies, and there's really not anymore. It's also true in foreign capitals. Remember when the Charlie Hebdo attacks happened in Paris not too long ago? Do you know that there was only 2 American papers had an actual journalist there in Paris? And actually, one of my passions is Africa, and in particular maternal health issues in Africa. When Ebola happened, there's no reporters on the ground. So you had misinformation, and I wish that I could wave a magic wand and say, oh, okay, now there's enough money to support bureaus in all of these foreign capitals. There's just not. And we're not even doing it in our own capital. There's just a lot more public policy communication that could be done and written about, or videoed, whatever it might be, if we had reporters that were willing to see that what's happening at the White House is not representative of what's happening all across the government.
But it's so there used to be a press office for non-governmental press in all of the agency buildings. Mm-hmm. Right? There are basically in none of the buildings now. Mm-hmm. So there was a beat reporter who would sit in the building, mm-hmm. and he or she would just know mm-hmm. all the appointees. They'd know what was going on. They'd know the issues. They would be versed and be able to really communicate out. And that's been lost. So we only, and I think this has contributed to some of the challenge in government, we only hear the extreme bad story. That's the only time when these agencies get attention, that someone will send a correspondent reporter to go to the place and find out what happened. It's got to be something that stands out, and so mm-hmm. we lose a lot of that stuff. I do think that, and I'm curious as to your view on this, we've seen a transformation in reporting, and the field has changed in such a way. I mean, in Peggy Noonan's book, she talks about how CBS started to pull back mm-hmm. its foreign core in reporting, and we've seen this across the board. Newspapers, even local newspapers are pulling back. This is a technology. People have said that this is a technology issue. Do you think it's technology that's driving this, or is there a way that we can sort of return to having sort of a world scope in coverage so that we actually can not get misinformation on Ebola that leads us to have panics here?
Terrible panics. I know, that was horrible.
That was crazy.
If somebody could figure out the model to be able to effectively monetize local advertising for local news on your mobile phone, I think that it would be revolutionary. But so far, that has not happened. Think back to even the San Diego Union Tribune. I lived in San Diego for 3 years, and I got the paper because I'm a paper-getting kind of person. I like the hard copy paper. Well, after a while, I got frustrated with the San Diego Union UT because every story in there was from The Wire, Associated Press, or Reuters, and I said, when it came back up for a renewal, I said, why would I keep getting this paper? There's no reason to. I actually read all of this on Yahoo last night. So I think that the newspaper industry was slow years and years ago, like 15 years ago. They were slow to get off the mark. I don't think they saw any of this coming, and the technology overwhelmed them. And I don't know how it returns.
We're seeing, like you just talked about.
Just remember, I started as a press secretary in 1995 on Capitol Hill, and then I worked through communications to 2008. So I saw a big change. That was kind of like around the time that the change was happening, and the media wasn't realizing how big it was, and including us. I used to, when I first heard about Twitter, I thought, oh God, I don't need to do that. I don't have who has time for Twitter. And I would always get frustrated that reporters seem to want to get the story out first and ask questions later.
I think that's changing, and part of it is peer pressure. One of the things I have learned is that most reporters are writing for one another. They're not writing for you. This is a peer competition issue. I would see it in the White House briefing room every day. I'm like, oh, okay, so the New York Times wrote that for the Washington Post and vice versa. And that's okay. The great thing about Twitter or Facebook or social media is that there is now a peer pressure check, and it's almost immediate, to the point that you don't want to be the first to get out there and have it wrong because the humiliation is terrible. So I actually think that it's actually been better. I really do. I think that that part of it is improved and will continue to be so.
That's very interesting, because I have a love-hate relationship with Twitter.
I know.
Because
Me too.
it's very instant.
I went through something this summer that was just something I'd never really experienced, and I use Twitter for posting dog pictures, and
that's a good one.
Yeah. But I like it as a news resource. In fact, and I find myself, I'm the most well-read, definitely, but I'm also the first to know things because I'm a little obsessive and I check it out and I know the right people. You have to be selective about who you're following so you can get a sense. I also follow some crazy people on the left and the right just so I can see what's coming, down the pike. So I have this love-hate relationship with it as well, but I do think that I'm a more well-rounded news consumer because of Twitter than I was before. Because now I see articles that I would never have seen before. And one of the things I started when I was at the White House is a weekend reading folder. Because I'd come across articles sometimes, like let's say you have to read about the budget, but you really want to read the article about the butterflies. So what I would do, instead of feeling anxiety about like not having enough time to read all of those things, I would cut out the story of the butterflies and put it in my weekend reading folder. And I do that now. Like last weekend, I read this piece from the New York Times Magazine about the marketing and the rise in marketing of Nicki Minaj. Like, I'm interested. I'm like, I don't know. I don't really know anything about that world, and I want to know more. So I have a weekend reading folder. And now there's a great app that I use. I'm sure there's others, but I'm not trying to. I don't advertise for them. But Pocket. Does anyone use Pocket? It's an app where you see a link that you might want to read on Twitter or Facebook, and you don't have time, and you just press this little thing to send to Pocket. So it's like putting it in your pocket. So then, when I was on the plane last night, and we didn't have Wi-Fi on the plane, but I still had access, I could just go to my Pocket because it's automatically cached. I don't have to wait for it to download. And I can read so much more now, and I feel like I'm a much more well-rounded news consumer because I see things from the Huffington Post and other places that I never would have seen before. Plus, Pocket sends me twice a week suggested articles that I might be interested in. And a lot of them are great, especially for sort of career development and mentoring. I've learned things from there that I wouldn't have had time to have seen before. So I think there's a silver lining in all of it, too.
So that's brilliant. I'm going to get
the weekend reading folder?
This Pocket thing.
Oh, Pocket, yeah.
Because I'm bad with technology, so I see a lot of things I can't read it. I never know how to actually save the link
Pocket's
and get
easy.
back to it. So
And that's the other thing for young people in the room, or if you have want to know the best way to be indispensable to your professors or your boss is to become a reverse mentor. So somebody in here should come to Raphael today and say, let me set up your Pocket for you. Okay? And then Raphael will be like, thank you so much. That's how I ended up on Twitter, because I had an employee who said, I think you should really do Twitter. I said, how is that going to enhance me and my business and my work? I mean, I don't need another like silly little thing to do online. And I kind of bit her head off probably, but she persevered and she said, do you mind if I set it up for you? I'm like, sure, knock yourself out. So she did. She showed me how to do 2 or 3 things, set it up, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh. So she didn't make me feel inept. Okay, she didn't ridicule me. Some young people, like if I always say I need a teenager in the house to help me because my husband and I it's getting worse and worse by the day. Like, how do you use this printer? I don't know. But if you have a teenager, they're like, okay, we can do that in 2 seconds. But young people should try to find a way to help their managers or their supervisors because it absolutely makes you more indispensable. And don't just do it because you think that he wants to post dog pictures, although I'm on full board with that. But because you can show him like this will help you in your life, in your job, or to be more well-rounded, or with a goal that you have, or help the bottom line, or help us be better communicators at whatever we're trying to do. I think there's a great opportunity for young people to find themselves indispensable at the workplace.
That's the best advice I've heard. I got a bunch of students who work for me. I'm going to make sure they see that clip. We're just going to run it on continuous loop.
Yeah.
Well, truth be told, one of my staff gave me a Twitter account that set me up as well, and that's the only reason.
I'll give you another example. Another example right now is Snapchat. You know how Snapchat started, right? It was right here on this campus, right?
Yeah.
Didn't he go here?
USC, yeah.
Yeah, Evan. But Snapchat has gone from that to this amazing reach of news. Okay, I would never go on Snapchat to see news because I have 100 other ways to get news. But I was this summer with a family that have two teenagers, and she said to me, "Oh, are you on Snapchat?" I'm like, "I can't figure out how to do Snapchat." I'm like, "I've set up a Jasper dog chat for my dog. I did a couple things." I'm like, "I don't get it. I don't see why it is." I said, "But will you show me what you look at?" She said, "Sure." So she shows me. I'm like, oh. And the numbers of people that are following the debates, young people following the debates on Snapchat, it's in the tens of millions. Forget that CNBC got 10 million people viewing last night. Tens of millions of people actually followed the debate on Snapchat last night. It is astounding. And they have partnerships with CNN and a couple of other news agencies. The Daily Mail maybe is another. And again, I because of my experience with Twitter, of being a skeptic early on and then realizing the benefits, I'm trying not to be a Neanderthal when it comes to things like Snapchat. Like, do we use Snapchat to get your news? See, this is the thing. We have to be talking to them to figure out how are they getting their news so that as communicators we can get in front of it.
So all I can tell you is you're not on a college campus, so you're not reminded repeatedly how inadequate you are with your technology. Yeah, I mean, I am routinely amazed at the stuff that the students are accessing. I don't know how did you find that article? How do you hear about these things? And it's about using technology fundamentally differently than I do. And things that are intuitive to them are just not intuitive. It's so far away that
Do we have time for me to make another point on this issue? As communicators, here's another thing that's happening in my more traditional politics 2016 update speech. I've hit upon something that I think is very interesting and worth some further study and exploration, because I really am interested in generational studies. So how the baby boomers and Generation X and the millennials all interact with each other. And on Pocket, you'll see there's a ton of art. I don't know whether they send these specifically to me because I'm kind of interested in it, but they probably are. But I am really interested in like how the generations work together. And you know, Generation X get frustrated with millennials because they're like, well, no one helped us do anything, and everyone's helping you do everything, and vice versa, and there's frustration. This election, for the first time in a long, long time, you have 3 distinct generations all voting. And so baby boomers, big generation. Generation X, we're kind of sandwiched in between. I'm an Xer. And then you have the millennials. 50,000 Latino people in America turn 18 every month. So the numbers are going to be huge in terms of who all is voting. And baby boomers, Xers, and millennials have very different viewpoints on the world. They are, baby boomers are starting to think about their retirements, and millennials are thinking, how are we going to pay for your retirement, let alone our own? Generation Xers are thinking, well, I'm paying for her college and my mom's retirements, her health care. And so all of these things, all of this is playing into this 2016. So an interesting study, if you guys are having to do this, if you're looking at one of the future debates, is imagine what it's like to be in those 3 distinct generations, and how, if you had Frank Luntz here doing a dial test, how each of them are very different. So how we communicate, depending on, remember those different audiences, like if you're having to deal with the budget issue, you have distinct audiences. Imagine you're a presidential candidate. Let's take Hillary Clinton, for example. She's got Bernie Sanders coming up on her left. So she's got to say that now she's not for the trade deal. But meanwhile, all of her supporters are like, what do you mean you're not for the trade deal? Because you've been for the trade deal for 30 years. How does that change? What happened? But she's talking to a different audience, both older people and younger people, on the trade issue, and she's forgetting this audience over here. Does that matter? I don't know. So I just find the generational issue to be very, very interesting in this election.
It's a difficult calculus because the numbers are big in all the spaces, and it's not clear how it all plays out because you have the issues and then you have the weighting of the issues. So environmentalism.
Social Security reform is a big one.
It's a huge issue.
20 years ago, baby boomers were absolutely for Social Security reform, for figuring out how to slow the growth or cut. Now, baby boomers like, don't you dare cut it.
How's that working for
Like,
you
I'm
now?
not for reform.
Exactly.
Generation X is thinking, how are we going to pay for all of this? And millennials are thinking, well, that's never going to be an issue for me anyway, so I don't
right.
care. It's very interesting to me.
Well, it'll be very interesting to see how this all sorts out. We will be able to watch you talk about
I hope so.
your reactions on this on national television every day on the 5. And I didn't mention the title of your book, so I did want to
okay.
do that. We've talked. This has been a 90-minute conversation, and to me, it went in felt like 10 minutes. We're just getting started. We could do this for a long time. The book is going to be more of that. So the book is called "And the Good News Is: Lessons and Advice from the Bright Side." I would encourage you all to go get a copy. There's some copies in the audience right now.
Great.
Dana, it's so. I mean, I was very excited when you agreed to come visit us. This conversation has done nothing to reduce that excitement.
good.
I hope you all enjoyed this as much as I did. Please join me in thanking Dana very much.